So an important development from liberalism is this idea that we shouldn't be confined to the accident of birth, that if we work hard, we have the right to rise to the top. But if we're looking at this picture here of Brazil during the World Cup, we can see quite a contrast between the living standards of groups of people. So on the right, you have the favelas, and you can see it's very overcrowded, very basic housing, quite a lot of crime, and very, very low social mobility. Then on the left, you can see a gated community, essentially, with tennis courts, swimming pool, a pool on every balcony, and just living in an excess of wealth, essentially. So do we actually live in an equal society? I think looking at this picture here from Brazil, clearly not. But it's not always as overt as this. It's still the same in Britain today, that we have rich people and poor people who live very different lives and have experienced things like lockdown very differently as well. So why is it that there are rich people and there are poor people? Is it simply to do with social Darwinist beliefs in that poor people just are less equipped to do well in society because they are born worse off in terms of capabilities, so they are just less able, therefore they get less out of society? Or is there something else? So with liberalism, this inequality is justified, and that justification comes from the idea that if you work hard, you will be rewarded. But is that actually true? So you all have, according to liberalism, the equal chance to succeed. You just have to have the work ethic to claim and take that opportunity. But this isn't quite true. And if we're looking at society today, there is a giant wealth gap. There are people who have, and there are people who have not. You have the 1% who have essentially most of the wealth of a country. So how does liberalism attempt to reconcile freedom and equality? Because essentially, when you're living in poverty, you don't have freedom. Because one of the things that freedom is it's about the opportunity to have choices. So the choice of going out for food, the choice of where to eat, the choice of what to have for dinner, the choice of where to go to school, where to go to university, the choice of what job to have, and so forth. So that's essentially what freedom is. It's about the ability to choose. So it's about us all having the equality to have the ability to choose, but liberalism doesn't actually deliver that in practice. And if we're particularly looking at what life was like in the 19th century, there was definitely no freedom for the poor there. So we still have these classical liberal ideas and this idea that hard work will be rewarded. But in reality, as we can even see, the death toll in Harlesden is the highest in the country for coronavirus. But compared to Kingston, which is in the same city as Harlesden, the same city as Brent, Kingston has had hardly any deaths and hardly any infections. And that's because of the differences in the lives of these people. So in Harlesden, we live in overcrowded households because we have less money. We do the jobs which are dangerous, the care workers and so forth. Whereas in Kingston, they're going to be a lot more professional. So we do still have this really huge wealth gap in society today. And I would say there was a slight improvement after the Second World War, but it got worse again in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher, which we'll look at in a little bit in a few lessons' time. So we may have moved away from certain elements of classical liberalism, and as you saw in the documentary you watched, the idea that the state shouldn't get involved in public health and that the state shouldn't regulate business, but we're seeing the states doing that. So we had the fact that the Conservative government gave workers furlough, gave them 80% of their salaries. That is an intervention which we wouldn't have usually seen under classical liberalism. So it's essentially because, as we can see, if people weren't being paid for accepting lockdown, then people would carry on going to work and everybody would still get sick. So essentially, classical liberalism is unsustainable, partly because it just increases the wealth gap to the extent that there will just be riots, there will be absurd poverty and so forth as well. So how does it try to reconcile freedom and equality? And this is something called the principle of justice. And this is a really important development in liberalism. And this is the beginnings of modern liberalism. So looking at equality, but also looking at the idea of justice. So essentially, all liberals believe that individuals are born equal. We have equal moral worth, and we have natural rights, or we call them human rights, and that society is difference blind. So one of the things that is said a lot by people who are liberals is that they are colourblind, they don't see a difference in colour. However, as we understand in society, that's just nonsense. Everybody does see colour, and by saying that you don't see someone's colour, you're saying that you're essentially seeing them as white, which is awful. So the principle of liberals is this belief that individuals are born equal. So there's the idea then of equality of opportunity. So classical liberals then say that it's about rewarding merit and ability to work. So this is going to create a natural inequality of wealth, because there will be some people who don't have as much. But to liberals, that's because it's about rewarding merit, and if you haven't worked as hard, you won't get as much as somebody else, sort of thing. So there is an inequality of wealth because people need to be treated differently. You need to be poor to have an incentive to work hard so that you can be rich, for example. And classical liberals and liberals in general actually will argue that if everybody got paid the same amount, people would stop working as hard. Not quite, I don't quite agree with that, but anyway. So essentially this is their idea then, but as we've seen in society, it's not quite translated, has it? Because society, in terms of the establishment and those people in power, they are predominantly white, they are predominantly male, and they are predominantly heterosexual as well. So are we just arguing, if we're going to believe in this belief that hard work is rewarded, that it's just that these white straight men are just better than everybody else? Obviously that's not true. Those people who are at the top, a lot of them have been there through handouts, through their families, through inheriting their wealth, through knowing the right people to get the right job and so forth. So equality of opportunity is essentially a lie when we're just looking at it from a sense that just leave it alone, it will self-regulate, that sort of thing. So that's obviously not realistic. So this is what equality looks like. So everybody has the same thing. And as you can see from the little boy, he can't watch this baseball game at all because he's so small. The other one can just about see over the top, whereas the one who already had privilege, already had benefits, gets the same thing as these other two and has just an even better view than he had before. So that's classical liberal view. But this has actually been reformed and revisited by modern liberals, especially through John Rawls, who writes A Theory of Justice. And in this he says that economic inequality is only justifiable if it works for the poorest in society. I think that is so crucial. It's still acknowledging the classical liberal view that, you need to have an incentive to work hard, and that's the meritocratic idea of rewarding hard work. However, if you are going to have this inequality, it needs to be in a way that is fair for poor people. You shouldn't, when we're talking about the baseline for poverty, it shouldn't be that there are people in the UK, one of the richest countries in the world, who don't have food, who don't have a roof over their heads. Because if you are poor, you don't even have a roof over your head, how are you going to even think and concentrate inside school? You won't in reality. So it's essentially about saying, if we really want to talk about equality of opportunity, then we need to actually try and maximise that opportunity to achieve equality. So it's about making it so that the poorest people in society still have a decent standard of life. And this is one of the things that he proposes. And he's saying we need to really look at society and reconsider the way that we've positioned society. And he's essentially acknowledging that people from his demographic, white men, have benefited the most in society because there's so much positive discrimination for white men. They have essentially had handouts, they have essentially had affirmative action as well, because they've just constantly getting the top jobs. And because they occupy that space, they continue to only let people of their demographic into those roles after them as well. So John Rawls said, we need to reconsider society. He said, no one knows, he's talked about this idea, of the veil of ignorance. He talks about this idea of considering the original position and considering, let's imagine that we could restructure society right now. So this is called a thought experiment, in the same way that the trolley experiment was a thought experiment. So he's saying, let's just consider society and imagine that we were building society right now. An important thing to consider in this idea of thinking about the poorest in society is we need to sit down and we need to think, no one knows his place in society, his class position or social status, nor does anyone know his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, so intelligence, his intelligence, strength, and the like. I shall even assume that the parties do not know their conceptions of the good or their special psychological propensities. The principles of justice are chosen behind a veil of ignorance. So essentially, if we all sat in a room and we said, okay, let's try and make a fair society. If it's a group of white men sitting in that room, they're going to argue, let's not change anything, it's working quite well. But if we all kind of didn't know where we sat in society and we thought, okay, there is a chance that we could be some of the worst off in society. We could be a working class black woman who is LGBT. So let's assume that we're that person in society. We need to make it so that the most disadvantaged in society has a better opportunity. And I'm pretty sure these men who are anti-positive discrimination, anti-affirmative action, anti-reparations would suddenly have a change of heart to say, oh, well, just in case I end up being in that category, or disabled, I forgot to mention that as well, then we need to make it so that there's social care for disabled people. We need to make it so that there's no discrimination in the workplace. We need to make it so that domestic violence is dealt with. We need to make it so that people believe the person who has accused someone as rape rather than drag her through the mud to justify her accusations and so forth. So if we don't know where we sit in society, we're going to try to structure a society that is fairer. So it's about benefiting the poorest people in society, and that's what justice is. So equality is everybody has the same. Justice is that everybody has what they need to have so that they can have equality of opportunity. And you can see the difference in this image here. This idea that instead of everybody having a box each, it's about saying the tall person doesn't actually need a box. He can actually see the game perfectly fine. It's about giving the small person 2 boxes so that they can actually access the game and get involved in society. So why is this so important? The centre of liberalism is the idea of the individual, and it's about the self-fulfillment of individuals. And the way that we become self-fulfilled is through the realisation of our distinctive and unique identity or qualities. So if we were thinking about this in terms of the art world, you can see here a picture on the left from the Middle Ages. And if you ever go to the National Portrait Gallery, I really recommend it when they open up again, you can actually see, what I really like about it is that it's chronologically presented. So as you go into each room, it represents a time period's art. And as you go through, you'll see that throughout the Middle Ages, the only art really being drawn were of kings or of the church. And that's because the only people who had the ability to express themselves through art were people who could afford it, essentially. And if we're thinking about art as the ultimate form of individuality, that's very limited. But then now, art can be translated for anything. So you've got Banksy is a massive artist and very, very popular, and he's able to actually create art in any way. He's able to fulfill himself in that sense. But he's talking here about this idea of following your dreams being cancelled, and he's referring to austerity Britain in that image there. And it's essentially this idea that in order for us to fulfill ourselves as individuals, in order to fulfill our identities and our qualities, we need to be fulfilled, we need to be nourished, we need to have somebody investing in us to do that. So previously only the rich were invested in, whereas now, due to the fact that we believe in a more modern liberal country, we have essentially more equal access to education. It's not equal education in the sense that private schools are obviously a lot more well funded, class sizes are smaller, resources are better, things like that, but it's essentially this idea that your teachers will try to fulfill your individual talents and about trying to help you fulfill yourselves. And that's possible through state intervention. And that intervention is essentially taking away wealth from people through taxation. So taking a percentage of everybody in the country's wealth and redistributing that to other people in society. So, for example, young people through the education system. And that's actually taking away the freedom of the many because it's taxing us, so taking away our property. But it's about redistributing that to help everybody in society. And this is this idea of individuality. So John Stuart Mill says, over himself and over his body and mind, the individual is sovereign. So he's essentially saying nobody can tell the individual what to do. And he's advocating a version of freedom, which is negative freedom. He's essentially saying just leave the individual alone. So negative, just leave them alone. However, if we leave people alone, we don't force people to go to school and so forth, then how are they going to be fulfilled? If we don't take away taxes from people, how are we going to fund things like schools and redistribute wealth to prevent poverty? How are we going to have a just system and a just society unless we actually take away some people's freedom in order to benefit everybody? And we saw this in terms of this idea of 19th century London. Did the British working class in the 19th century were they sovereign over their bodies and minds? Not really, no, because they were poor. They didn't have choice. They had to work ridiculously long hours to pay for their overcrowded room that they were renting and so forth. They don't have time to learn to read. They don't have time to debate and discuss philosophy. So they didn't have the power over their bodies and minds. It seems to be a privilege for only the rich to be able to be like that. So it's not a fair system. So John Stuart Mill, he's considered to be a bridge between classical and modern liberalism. And that's because he rejects the ideas that human beings are only self-seeking. In his identification of higher and lower pleasures, he really advocated this idea that human flourishing isn't just about the satisfaction of interests. So he's essentially saying that we need to nurture people's minds. And if we're going to nurture people's minds, we're going to have to provide some form of state intervention to help individuals have a fairer opportunity in society. And this was particularly advocated by T.H. Green, who was a British philosopher. Unfortunately, he's not on the spec as a named thinker, but he's a really powerful modern liberal example. And he essentially said, the life of a nation has no real existence except as the life of the individuals composing it. To speak of any progress or improvement or development of a nature or society of mankind, except as relative to some greater worth of persons, is to use words without meaning. So he's essentially saying that a country is only as rich as the poorest people in its country. So he's looking at what was going on in 19th century London in horror, because to look at the way that the poorest people were living in London, it's unfair, it's unequal, and it's inhumane as well. So he said that man is free when he is in that state in which he shall have realised the ideal of himself, shall be at one with the law, which he recognises as which he ought to obey, shall have become all that he has it in him to be, and so fulfil the law of his being. So he's essentially saying your freedom comes when you have the ability to fulfill yourself as an individual. So fulfill yourself through education, through doing your dream job and so forth. So he's essentially saying that the working classes in London were not free. They may not have been in prison, for example, though, but they still were not free. So this is impossible to fulfill through classical liberalism because of that strong belief in laissez-faire, this idea that the government does not get involved in the private business of the individual, the idea that the government just leaves individuals alone. Because if you leave individuals alone, you're leaving them alone to starve. And essentially, this freedom just becomes the freedom to starve if you are of a poor disposition. So he essentially is important because he influences later liberals and talks about the unrestrained pursuit of profit, which was classical liberalism, leading to greater injustice and poverty. And this is essentially what the classical liberal theory was. It's just greed. It's just unrestrained pursuit of profit. It's all about greed. It's about acquiring and hoarding wealth for no other reason than status. So he's saying human beings aren't actually self-seeking. They are actually altruistic. So altruistic in the sense that they are concerned for the interest and welfare of others. So it's either because we're rational and we care about what other people think and other people's position in society, or because we just believe that we are all brothers and sisters in a common humanity. So this is considered to be a socialist liberalism, or just referred to in terms of for this exam, just calling it modern liberal is fine as well. So this, you've been noticing that I've been using these terms interchangeably, negative freedom and positive freedom. And essentially these are really important terms in politics. They are the two concepts of liberty. And this was a term that was created by Isaiah Berlin. He was giving a lecture at Oxford in 1958, and he turned this into a pamphlet where he outlined these two concepts of freedom. And that's because liberty or freedom is a multifaceted idea. So to have freedom means that you can be freedom in the sense that people leave you alone. But if people just leave you alone, are they just leaving you alone to die at the same time? So he talks about two versions of freedom. He talks about negative freedom, which is freedom from interference from anyone else. So freedom from, negative freedom, is just about being left alone. It's the absence of interference. This is the freedom which is favoured by classical liberals because they believe that individuals are rational and so best suited to make decisions. And it's used as a justification against taxation, because taxation, they would argue, is just the punishment of the rich and the hardworking. And it's also used for the campaign of the legalisation of drugs. You have the right to take drugs because you are rational. You can make your own decisions about what's best for you. However, as we've seen in the last few lessons, there are huge limits to that because it's only freedom from, because you're rich, you can afford to not have to basically get help from the state and so forth. So modern liberals then advocate this idea of positive freedom instead. So this is the freedom to. So negative freedom is the freedom from interference. Positive freedom is the freedom to essentially make choices. Because if you have negative freedom, you can't make any choices because you can't afford to make those choices. For example, you can't afford to go on holiday because you don't have enough money in your bank account because your job pays you so badly. So positive freedom is saying you have the freedom to make choices, often restricted by poverty and lack of opportunity. So you have the freedom to climb in a meritocratic society because it's about empowering you to do that. So things like giving you a good education, having a minimum wage so that everybody gets paid a fair amount, so that workers don't have to have a race to the bottom to who can work for the least amount of money so that they can be guaranteed a job. It's also, so this is an attempt by modern liberals to address the inequalities which grew out of classical liberal ideas, and also the argument that negative freedom was the freedom to starve, and that the state should intervene to help lift people out of poverty and thus maximise their freedoms and choices. So positive freedom is about trying to rectify the inequalities which were so overt in classical liberalism, and it's about trying to give people greater opportunities to be successful and giving them freedom in a sense. But the only way that they're able to do that is from taking away freedom from others through things like taxation. So what you're going to do then is on the Google Doc, I've put different figures that you're going to try and work out what type of freedom would they prefer and why.